Well, first, allow me to suggest that I think you just gave your Simcoe County Environmental Award to a giant, and I think that people across this country will be delighted to hear that you've done that. I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to a place in Canada where water goes when it wants to demonstrate how much it can shape and refine the identity of a people through the prosperity it brings by way of ecological functions, and the quality of life it creates when its aesthetic properties are recognized and valued. You have so much here that the rest of the world aches for. You have reliable, clean, adequate water resources. You have agricultural capacity that optimizes the food production potential of those water resources. You have unusually abundant, reliable, and safe groundwater sources. And last but hardly least, you have an engaged citizenry that knows the value of its own water and is prepared to make not just ritual but actual sacrifices to be worthy of having those water resources. I will tell you that these circumstances, the ones that you might take for granted, are increasingly uncommon in Canada and rare elsewhere in the world. And these are conditions that may not persist even here over the long term without tremendous diligence and care. The goal of the Canadian Partnership Initiative in support of the United Nations Water for Life Decade is to draw attention to the importance of water to our identity and our way of life in Canada. And we wish, first of all, to dispel the myth of limitless water abundance in this country. We work also to translate scientific research outcomes into language the average person can understand and that decision makers can act on to craft timely and durable public policy. And finally, it's our goal to bring international example to bear on Canadian water issues, and I hope to advance all three of these goals this afternoon. I'm here today to talk about the global water crisis and what it means to Canada. And before I do that, I'd like to start by telling you a story. And every Canadian has a water story. And I've learned that even in the last 3 days of being here. Everyone here has one. Things happen on water. Water is part of who we are. And whether you live in the Rocky Mountains, where I do, or here in the Great Lakes, our stories inevitably converge around water left behind by the last ice age. And like many of you, I think I have an intimate connection to at least one river, the Saskatchewan. And I came to know the Saskatchewan quite by accident. As everyone here knows, water can be a very dangerous thing. And the accident that shaped my life happened on the Columbia Icefield, the birthplace of the Saskatchewan and the Athabasca rivers, and the major upland contributor to the Columbia. And like many people who came to work in the Rocky Mountains, I was young, I was 20. That meant I had my life all worked out. I was going to graduate, I'd picked a wife, I'd picked a house, there would be a dog, there would be a cottage on a lake, and also I would drive a wood-paneled Ford station wagon. Ergo, then, you can tell that I was prepared for the good life. And then I fell unroped into a crevasse on the Saskatchewan Glacier. And this story is still told to disbelieving tourists. Imagine this, a man actually disappeared beneath the ice and was washed through the biggest glacier in the Rocky Mountains and came out under its snout. And I can understand their disbelief, because what happened really is hard to believe. So here's my story. After viewing a dizzying array of mountain climbing slides projected on a wall by a friend, I decided immediately that I wanted to be a mountaineer. And then there's no point in half measures. So the first backpacking trip I ever did in my entire life was across the Columbia Icefield. I only had 2 days off, but in my opinion, that ought to be enough. As I was 20, well, how big can an ice field be? So the accident happened while descending the Saskatchewan Glacier on the afternoon of the second day. I was cold and I was wet and I was worn out. All I wanted to do was to get down. And I was so tired that I'd given up trying to avoid the meltwater streams that coursed across the glacier's broken surface. And unless you travel on a really big glacier, it's hard to imagine how much melt can occur on a hot day. There's actually rivers flowing across the surface of the ice. And seeking a direct line, I tried to cross one of these. And The power of the icy water lifted me up and carried me to the mouth of a huge crevasse. Then I dropped out of the known world. And one moment I was looking at the sun sparkle of splashing water, and a moment later I was in the center of a waterfall plunging into complete darkness beneath the ice. And the waterfall cascaded down a series of chapped ice lips to join the river that flowed beneath the glacier. And never before or since have I heard from everywhere around me so many of the different sounds that water makes. Here I was inside a planetary artery examining firsthand what water does to the world. But you can imagine I had this little problem. There's only a few inches separating the top of the water and the roof of the ice. And in darkness, I kept smashing into boulders and scraping against the underneath of the glacier. And just as shock and wonder were beginning to evaporate, just as calm was to become absolute terror, the strangest thing happened. The ice above began to glow, and at first it was a faint green, and as the river swept me onward, the glow intensified. Green gradually merged into a pale, glowing blue. I noticed then that rocks were hanging out of a ceiling made entirely of light. And then I popped out of the glacier into the sunshine and was washed into the full flood of the North Saskatchewan River, where my problems really began. And I want to point out the accident, like many things on water, changed everything. My life flowed toward unexpected ends. I never did get that Ford wood-paneled station wagon. But I realize now that I have spent the rest of my life trying to prevent my culture from carrying me permanently downstream and away from the luminous glory of that subglacial light. And I think also our whole society has done that. We have moved away from the strong connection we once had with water. It's well known that our blue globe is, by definition, a water world. It's recognized that 97% of the water on this planet is salty, leaving only 3% of it fresh enough to sustain terrestrial life. And of that 3%, much of the world's fresh water is bound in ice or made inaccessible to us by the depth at which it resides beneath the surface of the earth. And what's really interesting is the same 4/1000ths of 1% of the Earth's total water sustains us as it did every civilization and every ecosystem since the beginning of time. And history, we discover, is littered with the artifacts of societies that declined simply because they could not overcome the effects of local resource depletion and manage the impacts of population expansions that accompanied their own initial success. And it's interesting to see that history. A hallmark of failed societies of the past is a growing dependence on water engineering ingenuity that defies natural design. And the long record of the rise and fall of hydraulic societies throughout history demonstrates that an abundance of water is important and necessary for the development of a strong, independent state. But abundance of water does not assure that. Abundance of water is in itself no guarantee of economic prosperity or long-term sustainability of a nation, an empire, or a civilization. History tells us that what is required for survival and sustainability is the prudent management of water in the broadest range of changing economic, social, political, and environmental circumstances. And when you look at our society, we recognize it now as the greatest of all hydraulic civilizations. By the year 2000, we had constructed some 45,000 large dams that, in combination with the hundreds of thousands of smaller structures, quadrupled water storage for human purposes in only 40 years. And depending upon the time of the year, 3 to 6 times the water that exists at any given time in all of our world's rivers is now stored behind dams. No one, however, examined or was able to predict the cumulative global scale effect uncoordinated dam building, irrigation diversions, and the related impacts of deforestation on the timing and extent of water availability or on water quality. No one could anticipate this. The changes were so rapid. And add to these the impacts of groundwater overdraft globally, and belatedly, we realize our own potential to alter the world's water cycle. And it's become clear now that human activity has begun to affect the planet's very hydrology. Our presence and our actions have altered the very composition of the atmosphere in which our precipitation forms and from which our rain falls. We have altered how much land cover exists to capture, store, purify, and release water that falls from the sky. We have affected rain and snowfall patterns and how much river water flows and how or whether our rivers even make it to the sea. The same ecosystem depletions and limitations that brought down earlier empires all over the world are beginning to appear on a global scale. And the growing awareness of these threats presents us with a fundamental crisis of values that may mark a junction in the narrative not just of the human journey, but of the story of life on Earth. Within the current narrative, water is seen as essential to rapidly expanding human populations that grow ever more wealthy by ignoring the requirement for equitable water allocation to all and the pressing water needs of natural landscapes around them. We realize now that we can't continue to act in this way without risking the collapse of the very systems upon which we depend, not just for our survival, but for meaning and for value in our lives. So we face a choice. We can choose to carry on as we have and hope for a silver technological bullet that will solve the manifold array of water-related problems that we've created for ourselves. Or we can create and act upon a new narrative, one in which scientific knowledge and technological sophistication are equitably balanced against broader cultural and environmental values. And here, where you live, is a place where such an ethic could emerge. And the bringing of such a narrative into being will require a new water ethic. And my argument this afternoon will be that if we wish to achieve any meaningful degree of sustainability, we need to create that ethic now. Those who live in this country owe a great deal to water. For the nearly 500 years that have passed since Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence, that most historic of Canadian rivers, water's made us wealthy, and as often happens with wealthy people, we have over time lost touch with the source and true nature of our wealth. Where once we carried around in our minds a detailed mental map of the country's great rivers, we have since broken with the sinuous, sensuous nature of our past. We live in a linear world defined by the straight line logic of the train, the car, and the plane. And thus we find that in a country that's not even a century and a half old, we find ourselves yet again in a watershed. We're discovering that we can't take our water resources for granted. We found to our dismay that the qualities that make water so diversely valuable to us are the very same qualities that easily allow it to become contaminated, polluted, or lost. And as our population is growing, and the range of our agricultural, industrial, and recreational activities multiplied, even we in Canada have strained our water resources. And at the same time, we've come up against the limits of what we know and can predict about how much water we'll have in the future. Though we really shouldn't be surprised, we're astonished to discover that the same circumstances that have created a global water crisis elsewhere are beginning to appear here. Our surface waters are increasingly contaminated. The water that flows in many of our southern rivers is fully, if not over-allocated to human purposes. And algal blooms are appearing in many of our streams, rivers, and lakes as a result of short-sighted agricultural practices. We are now home to the largest toxic tailing ponds and the largest surface mines in the world, which has cast us in a bad light on the international stage. Well, it's widely accepted that much is being done to properly manage groundwater in places like the Oak Ridge Moraines area. Groundwater quality in southern Canada has deteriorated to such an extent coast to coast that we're now contaminating aquifers that we share with the United States. Boil water advisories now appear year after year in dozens of the same communities, and nowhere in Canada are you advised to drink untreated water. Now, while you may not have noticed this much here, what is really interesting is that in a single generation, one lifetime, we have gone from a nation that took pride in the fact that one could drink from almost any river, sparkling stream or lake in the country, to a nation seriously concerned about water quality and availability now and in the future. And from this, it's very easy to figure out the direction that history is flowing with respect to this most important of all natural resources. Problems with water resources are here to stay. And the extent of these problems in themselves would suggest that it's time for water to re-enter the Canadian consciousness, that it's time for a new Canadian water ethic. But there's more to this than that. In addition, warming will mean annual temperatures are projected to result in further changes in the timing and extent of precipitation in many parts of the country. And we find ourselves, in addition to this, even though we may be living in a place or in a region in which climate effects are not as dramatic or as obvious as they are elsewhere, we find ourselves in a very interesting geopolitical situation with respect to both water on this continent and globally. Global warming is lining up to be a potential Hiroshima in terms of reliability of national and regional water supplies all over the globe. A new world order is about to emerge out of the collision between population and economic growth and our planet's rapidly changing hydrology. Where once we were concerned about peak oil, now we're talking about peak water. Already, the divide is growing globally between freshwater haves and have-nots, and this explosive fault line is likely to widen across the entire 21st century political, social, and economic landscape. India, for example, is expected to experience a 50% water shortfall by 2030. 2030 is not that far from now. The water shortfall in China will be 25% by 2030. The gap between water haves and have-nots will grow between those who control upstream water flows and downstream neighbors who do not receive all the water they need for industry and for their cities. The gap will widen even more between nations that have sufficient water supplies to grow their own food and those who do not. 85% of the world's 525 million farms are less than 5 acres. We are at the very minimum faced with the prospect of having to produce twice as much food with perhaps as much as 30% less water. And we'll have to do this within 40 years if we're expected to meet the food production goals of the population that will exist in 2050. But water availability will not just affect food production. The amount of water available to a given nation will determine its industrial capacity and the quality of life that citizens enjoy as a result of nature receiving the water it needs to make places worth living in. Prosperous countries in the world will be those that have enough water for food, enough water for cities, for industry, and for nature, and that know how to ensure that each gets what it needs. Increasingly, the response to global water scarcity will not be defined, as we fear, by direct transfers of liquid water between regions and countries. It will instead be determined by how much water is traded by nations in the form of water embodied as food and other products that require considerable water for their production. So right now is the year of 2000. About 1,000 cubic kilometers of water were traded from nation to nation in the form of food. We have yet to calculate the relative virtual water benefit of exporting and importing other trade goods, but we will have to do that soon. Models predict that by 2050, some 53% of the world population will be facing one form or another of water scarcity. And if that happens, then countries that need to make up for inadequate water supply by having to import water virtually as food will require a virtual global water transfer of 7,500 cubic kilometers a year. And I would suggest to you that that's a lot of water. And that could be of tremendous importance economically to Canada. Some people have predicted that as a result of that trade, agriculture will ultimately become more important to the economy of Canada than oil and gas. Now, if you want to play in that game, however, we have to change the way we regard and manage our water resources. And the first step, in my estimation, is to dispel some of our myths. The first myth that we have to examine relates to how much water we actually have. If we do not dispel the myth of limitless water abundance in Canada, we will continue to make public policy choices based on false assumptions that could have undesirable ecological, social, and political consequences in the future. Now, we may have 20% of the world's total freshwater resources, but we only have about 2,850 cubic kilometers, or roughly 6.5% of the world's total renewable water resource, which is to say the volume of water renewed annually by the hydrological cycle. So we should also recognize, as I said before, that most of the water is left over from earlier periods. Much of it's in the north where most Canadians live, and much of it's in the north while most Canadians live in the south. And what we're seeing here is the ice age element of water storage is beginning to play an important role. What we're seeing in many places is that the water left behind by wetter, colder periods is about to disappear. And if that current trend persists, there's no assurance that water available to us today will be here for us tomorrow. So let's go back to where I live. According to the World Glacier Monitoring Service, there are about 160,000 glaciers on this planet, which cover an estimated 685,000 square kilometers. And in most places in the world where glaciers have been studied, however, efforts haven't been very continuous, resulting in lengthy gaps in the data collected. So globally, and this may surprise you, there are only 39 glaciers that have been studied for more than 30 years, and only 30 reference glaciers that exist that have been subject to continuous measurement since 1976, and we have only one of those. So research conducted on the 30 reference glaciers around the world indicates a cumulative glacial loss of 20% in the 60 years between 1945 and 2005, which suggests, most interestingly, that a great deal of the world's ice has already become water. But as I'll demonstrate, the area covered by glaciers in the Canadian Rockies has been much reduced even in the last 5 years. And the loss of ice isn't limited to the length of glaciers, but more significantly to their depth. Our glaciers are down-wasting at a very rapid rate, and now there are concerns about how long they will last and what the impacts of their disappearance might be. Now, in Canada, or if you've been following this at all, most of the attention's been focused on the rapid loss of glacier ice in places like Glacier National Park in the United States, where 113 of the 150 glaciers that existed in 1860 have vanished. And the reason that that focus has existed is because they actually knew what was happening to their ice. And until recently, we didn't. But now we do. And what we've discovered is in the last 20 years, in the Western Mountain National Parks alone, we have lost as many glaciers as existed a century ago in Glacier National Park in the United States. We now know that we lost 300 glaciers in the Canadian Rockies between 1920 and 2005. And some 150 of these glaciers disappeared in the 65 years between 1920 and 1985. And the other 150 glaciers disappeared into thin air in the 20 years between 1985 and 2005. So from that, we can surmise that our losses appear to be accelerating. Now, I want to show you what this looks like. Dr. Gary Clark at the University of British Columbia is one of this country's leading glaciologists. And Clark's time-lapse animation of what warmer temperatures could do to the remaining glaciers in the Canadian West don't exactly invite reverie. These animations are going to be troubling, especially to those who know the landscapes they portray. So I've tried to pick an area that some of you would have gone. This is the Icefield Parkway between Lake Louise and the Columbia Icefield. And this shows the 6 major ice fields, the Waputtock in the bottom, the Wapta, the Mummery, the Mons, the Lyell, and then the Columbia Icefield where most of you might have gone. And just based not on increased temperatures that might be projected to the future, but based on what has happened to these glaciers in the last 40 years, Gary Clark and his colleagues estimated how much ice might be left a century from now. So here we are now, and here we see the beginning of this loss during the course of the period. And notice in this is quite interesting that the glacier recession doesn't occur just from the valley floor upward, but from the tops of the mountains downward because of higher temperatures aloft. So there it is in 2100. There it is now. There it is in 2100. So what you get from this is the beginning of an understanding of exactly how much could be lost in terms of water in the bank left over after the last ice age. And this is quite interesting to note. I'm going to show you one glacier that many of you will be at, because some of you I know will have traveled to the Columbia ice field and taken a snow coach ride on this glacier, the Athabasca. So I want to show you what those same projections would do to maybe the most famous glacier in this country and one that you might have all visited. So here's how this is done. You use ground-penetrating radar to determine the subsurface topography, and then you analyze under a variety of climate change scenarios how much water will be left. So here it is now, and here's this famous glacier as we proceed through the coming decades based on temperature losses over the last 40 years. It's going to be hard to take a snow coach on that. So what I'm suggesting to you here is that, well, what is happening to our glaciers is of great importance to the future climate of the Mountain West. They may not be as important in terms of total water supply as one other element that is portrayed in these models. We already know that long before global warming has finished reducing the length and depth of our glaciers, it'll already be after its mountain snowpacks. So the same influences that are causing the glaciers to melt are reducing how much snow falls and how long it lasts. And that can have a big impact on water supply. And I'll explain in a moment how this will affect you here in the West. In Western Canada, reduced flows in rivers will impact power generation and agricultural, industrial, and municipal water security throughout Western Canada. These flow reductions will also affect interprovincial water sharing agreements and transboundary agreements with the United States, such as the Columbia River Treaty. And what we're seeing here is that these changes in snowpack are just the beginning of other kinds of changes and relate to biodiversity that Bob was talking about. And in anticipating these changes, the past may not be a reliable guide to the future. So what I would like you to do is to watch this. When we look at the ecological effects of widespread glaciation, we see there are potential impacts that will cascade down into terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So what kind of climate might you expect in the future? Well, Dan Fagre and his colleagues at the United States Geological Survey have created this model, and I'll show it a couple of times here so you don't have to worry about where you're at in the moment. And it depicts glacial recession and landscape change as a consequence of global warming trends in Glacier Park in the United States. So watch this. It starts in 1850. And it shows the glaciers disappearing upward in altitude, and that's how they lost 113 of 150 glaciers over that time. But it also shows the warming trends and what they will mean projected in the future in terms of how vegetation zones will rise, replacing the alpine zone in the Rocky Mountains. And what you notice in here is really interesting. Glaciers disappear, alpine tundra rises up to where the glaciers were, forested regions come in. And then what happens, and I'll show it to you in this one quite directly, what happens then is that grasslands begin to move up into what were mountain forests. And this is a stunning proposition. So as temperatures rise over time, grasslands will rise up mountain slopes. And it's what's happening outside of this frame that's really important. So you see the grasslands starting to just gradually moving into the bottom here. And by 2100, you see the grasslands, there they are. What's happening outside of the frame here is what's really important. What you're not seeing, what you're seeing evidence of but not seeing outside the frame is desertification of the northern plains. And I have trouble convincing people in Ontario that this is a serious matter, but I assure you that it is. Where will we grow our food if not on the plains? And what kind of influence will the warming of the Great Plains have even in humid regions of Canada like where you live? Suddenly, how you manage water in Elmvale very much matters. So the point I want to make here is that we don't have as much water as we think we do, And we may have less than we have in some places in the future. And I think we spend way too much time in this country worrying about water exports to the US and not nearly enough time thinking about changes that are occurring within our own hydrological regimes. And this suggests that another myth we have to dispel, and I hear this everywhere across the country, the myth is that we are world leaders in the management of water resources. We are not. We are among the world's greatest wasters and polluters of water, and the opportunity here resides in realizing and changing that. And another myth that we have to dispel is that proper management of water resources is going to make everybody happy, because it's not. Very difficult trade-offs will mean that consensus will not be achievable on all water issues. And this means that higher levels of government will have to assert leadership in important water matters. And a good place for this leadership to begin is with re-examination of what actually constitutes our current water ethic. Ethics deal with problems that arise in disagreements regarding how we ought to deal with the problems we face in the world. And water policy experts have characterized these disagreements as difference of opinion in three fundamental areas. The first of these domains revolves around claims related to the actual state and fate of our current water supplies. Contention revolves around what we know about the condition of these resources and what we mean when we make the claim to adequate supplies and quality. The second fundamental disagreement that exists in our society revolves around how social relationships should be ordered with respect to the competing claims of economics, basic human rights to water, the rights of ecosystem to their own integrity, and the rights of people to property and prosperity. And finally, all of these considerations have to be balanced in an ethical framework against water's significance to people of often widely different beliefs or cultures. So whether we acknowledge it or not, the central principle of the contemporary water ethic in Canada, almost universally being practiced here, is the primacy of human dominion over water resources. This ethic is founded upon the widely held but often unexamined belief that water, like all of the planet's other natural resources, exists to be used at humanity's complete discretion. And in all matters related to water, human uses and needs automatically take priority. And what I'm suggesting to you on a global basis, that this is being challenged quite widely. And the main reason the ethic of human dominion is being widely rejected is that it has been shown over time to undermine the ecological foundations of life on this planet. And it's these foundations that make life not only possible, but meaningful, not just in Canada, but everywhere. So unless we want to contribute to our own and to global ecosystem decline, our relationship to water has to become a relationship with water. And to do this, our current water ethic has to change. If Canada was to have a new water ethic, well, what should it be? And while more than a dozen principles have been brought forward to the fore in answering this question, I'm going to only, for reasons of limited time here remaining, I'm going to discuss three. And the first is that, as was eloquently put into relief this morning, Canada has possessed its own carefully evolved hierarchy of values related to water for thousands of years. The origins of Canada's founding water ethic begin with the First Peoples of North America. And fundamental, as we saw this morning, to the First Nations water ethic is that the protection and use of waters is bound up in a notion of relationship based on responsibility and not just rights. And one case where we can see this is, and this is new and very interesting, respect for First Nations values and rights has to be the starting place, at least, for the creation of a new water ethic, because any other approach disavows history and the connection of Indigenous people to the lands and waters all across Canada. And it can be done. We see this. The recently ratified Northwest Territories Northern Voices Northern Water Strategy provides a model of how First Nations water ethics can be put into effective action to the long-term benefit of everyone. Principle 2, in the most political and corporate circles in Canada, it's still widely held that the marketplace will take care of the country's growing water woes. I would point out, however, there's no evidence that this is happening to the extent required to achieve sustainability. And some of you will know this. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith made the famous description of the market's unseen, invisible hand that miraculously transformed individual self-interest and competitive pursuit of profit into the wholesome maximization of wealth creation for the entire society. Yet, as evidenced by the deteriorating state of our global environment, the market has failed to evolve an adequate corresponding invisible green hand that compensates for the market's own environmental short-sightedness. There's no reliable mechanism in any contemporary market that automatically reflects the costs of depleting natural resources and maintaining overall environmental qualities upon which orderly, prosperous societies depend for their stability and sustainability. And while markets have demonstrated that they can increase water productivity or move water in the direction of higher or more beneficial use in its economic functions, market solutions at the moment appear to ignore the real problem. And here's the real problem as we see it. The real problem is that we lack a set of principles, laws, policies, and guidelines, essentially an ethical framework that stop us from chipping away at natural systems until there's nothing left of their life-supporting functions, which the market fails to value adequately if it's valued at all. And many argue that until a framework like this is developed, one that is legally enforceable, that demands that environmental concerns be met within market conditions, markets that commodify water use should be avoided. Now, there's a lot of examples here, and they're so close to us in Canada that they're almost invisible. There's current examples of where reliance on free market solutions is actually standing in the way of resolution of local, regional, and global water supply and quality issues. And the obvious example of this is that we will build water treatment systems everywhere at great cost rather than addressing the water quality issue through source water protection. In other words, we'll do everything we can but solve the problem. And the most classic example is the one that James Gordon brought up so brilliantly this morning, was the problem of bottled water and what it means. And I would like to talk briefly about that also. There are places, I regret, where bottled water is likely necessary, and because of local water quality, likely always will be. In the developed world, however, the marketplace success of bottled water is a triumph of marketing over common sense and appropriate action. And I thought James kind of nailed it this morning, the scam of the century. But I wanted to suggest that it actually goes beyond even what James scandalously said about bottled water this morning. I think he's completely right. We've allowed ourselves to be convinced through subtle and not so subtle manipulation of our desires to pay thousands of times more for what we already get for nothing. And the irony is that we drink bottled water even though billions are spent to ensure the quality of our public drinking water is the best in the world. And meanwhile, 1 billion people on Earth cannot afford reliable public water supplies or bottled water, and we say we don't have enough resources to help them. So if the $100 billion a year we spend on bottled water was committed instead to addressing the global water supply and sanitation crisis, there would be little need for bottled water in most parts of the world within a decade. To take that path, however, you need to make an ethical choice. In this book, Bottled and Sold, his landmark work on the story behind our obsession with bottled water, Peter Glick argues that the world is in the midst of a major transition in which he fears could be marked by the abandonment of our efforts to provide public drinking water for all in favor of private sector solutions like bottled water. So what I'm telling you, this goes way beyond you buying bottled water at the gas station. This is a major and serious issue. And the critique here is that there isn't a role for the marketplace or the private sector. The critique here is that we have to decide what direction we're going to go with this. Are we going to supply water for the world? Is public water going to be available? Are we serious about this, or will we allow our efforts to be undermined by private sector solutions that aren't solutions at all? I also note that when I look at the bottled water problem, it's unique in that it makes a great deal of money, none of which goes back to solving the problem that created the problem in the first place, which is upland watershed management and protection. And we also have to be careful to recognize in this country how much it really costs to have the kind of water infrastructure we have, to manage it as assets, but also to manage it so that we can afford to operate it over the long term and then to replace it. And in this, I think we're going to have to see a great number of new partnerships allowing us to make sure that instead of moving the bottled water route, that we build public water systems that work and work for over a long time. Water experts in Canada, including David Brooks and Oliver Brandis, have proposed a soft path to water supply solutions comprised of a comprehensive approach to sustainable water management founded upon equitable public access to water, proper application of economic principles, and appropriate incentives for efficient water use. And this soft path argues for comprehensive protection of aquatic ecosystems, for new sources of water supply, smart use of innovative technologies, and also improved water quality and delivery reliability brought about by everybody participating in water management solutions. And I think this has to be one of our ethics. We now know that the engineering-based models of hydrological cycles that inform our current water ethic in Canada have not taken properly into account the actual behavior of complex ecosystems, and they've failed to predict the catastrophic changes to biophysical processes caused by human interference in natural cycles brought about by the impacts of large dams, extensive irrigation projects, and attendant changes in land cover. And looking back, again, on what historians have labeled a passing era of hydrostructuralism, many are observing that perhaps we should not have declared water a natural resource in the first place, and that maybe we ought to retreat from that notion. And the first step in this process, they say, is the recognition that engineering-based assertions of passive and static ecological conditions are wrong. And as such, we've got to stop thinking this way, that these systems are not passive. We cannot build these huge structures without impacts. And what is occurring here globally is a growing realization of nature's need for water itself. And this notion revolves around new understandings about how different kinds of ecosystems generate, capture, purify, and release water. One of the things we have to realize is all our artificial systems mimic natural systems. And we're beginning to understand that if you modify and carefully manage integrated urban, municipal, agricultural, and natural systems, you can actually generate a lot more water. And also, we're realizing that in order for water to provide benefits to people, that nature needs water too. And it follows hence that nature can't be where we send water only after we have taken all that we need for other purposes. So what we're saying here is that we need a new kind of partnership. And the kind of partnership we need is that a recognition that, as Carolyn Merchant has famously argued, sooner or later fish have got to be at and not just on the table in these discussions. So it's got to be clear to everybody in this room, if you believe in any of the directions that I've described, that a new water ethic in this country is not going to be easy to sell. There's been a great deal invested in our current system. It's going to take time and political courage to create appropriate incentives and to direct the marketplace and the global economy toward fair, equitable, and just mechanisms that meet the water supply needs of all people and nature. And it's not just the precedents and habits of our economic system that are going to argue against the emergence of a new water ethic in this country. Whether you see it or not, we actually live in a fragmented and fractious society. Property rights, market fundamentalists, and libertarian forces in many parts of the country are very strong. And our current situation embeds the human relationship to water rather than with water into our entire system. And a proposal to change our ethic is going to result in a backlash against what will be perceived as environmentalism and what these interests may consider to be ecocentrism. And I think that the arguments could be very bitter They could be adversarial, they could be unreasonable, and they could be ongoing. Now, so what we've got here is that we've got a really messy situation in our hands, and determining what is sustainable and equitable in the context of human and non-human communities, we realize now, whether we like it or not, has to be renegotiated. And that renegotiation is going to be very difficult. It's going to take the highest order of statesmanship by all leaders in Canada to create broad-based, nonpartisan political support required to bring a new Canadian water ethic into being. So in order to prepare ourselves for the future, Canadians should be cultivating that leadership now. So, allow me to summarize. The points I'd like to leave with you are these. First, because of population growth and economic expansion, Canada is beginning to experience the same kinds of problems related to water that have created a global water crisis. And second, a new water ethic is essential to prevent water scarcity and quality issues from limiting our social and economic development in the future. And third, a new water ethic is also required if we wish to participate meaningfully in the emerging new world order that is organizing itself around the export of virtual water and food and other high-value products. Now, although there's a dozen principles that should be considered, I have introduced to you tonight 3. The first is that the foundation of any new Canadian water ethic has to respect First Nation rights and values. The second is that the goal of a new Canadian water ethic should include strong public and private sector commitment to expand safe, reliable public water supply through infrastructure development and improve asset management through water reuse and effective water pricing that actually encourages water conservation. The third principle of a new Canadian water ethic is the recognition of nature's need for water. The premise here should be that all people and all living things have equal rights to water to assure their survival before some get more than enough. Other principles that need to be explored include the crucial importance of monitoring both surface and groundwater so that the exact information can be made available for forecasting and prediction of what will happen in the future. We also need to establish mandatory, legally binding national drinking water standards. We need to make the link between water and energy. We need to tie agricultural policy to national water policy. And we need a water ethic that will help us transcend jurisdictional fragmentation and institutional territoriality that is so part of our bureaucratic systems so that we can once again manage our water on a watershed basis. So I believe that Canada's future does not have to reside in becoming a global fossil fuel energy superpower. Our future could just as easily reside in virtual water export and in the development of sustainable, scale-to-situation water supply solutions that make more productive use of available water supplies. And I'd like to close by saying this. Unlike so many places in the world, Canada still has room to move in how it manages its water resources. With a new ethic in place, we could become a sustainable society. Then we really would be leaders with something new and useful to share with the rest of the world. If this is what we desire, however, we should get moving while the room to move is still there. Thank you very much.